So I have chosen to focus on this question of to what extent does memory play an integral part in the evocation of fear in narrative illustration. The first of these is how memories of childhood fears haunt us. Traditional fairy tale images have colour and form that allow the image to not be scary. Perhaps for a child it still would be. Their tales are full of sorcerers and ogres because their lives are, Randall Jarrell stated about childhood images. Klein added to this that the child's fascination with fairy tale figures represents an expressionism and defence against infantile aggression and fear. However, leading on from these traditional images of fairy tales are Hockney's versions in 1970 that bring an adult form to these stories. They are etchings, detached, disjointed, strange, sexual, disturbing, and relates back to the ogres and sorcerers of childhood. They allow us to see these stories as adults as we perhaps did as children, as the images represented are so starkly bizarre and strange. They throw us off guard and they create an uncanny sense of what is real and what is memory, how fear works, and how childhood can feel so terrifying, and perhaps how we can feel that fear in the adult world. The second categorization is how memories of a traumatic experience are often more terrifying than the experience itself. The big example of this is, of course, PTSD and the art based on these experiences. Kathy Kollowitz's woodcut here shows 5 young men following the figure of death, some with enthusiasm, but some with despair and fear. As you can see, the figure on the left has a skull-like face. These images are not representative of real life. They are not figurative, but they work instead on the memory of the fear and violence that these actions and events had. This is arguably how this image represents the true fear and violence of the war, not through documentary, but through memory. These A-bomb drawings by civilians that survived Hiroshima are also a great example of this. The colour and form is obviously not representative of real life, but I feel as though it is the only way that these images convey the true feelings that these people had is through their memory. Gustav Dor's exploration of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner from 1877 I believe is a great example of this utilisation of memory, as the mariner's story is told from his perspective, and the way in which Gustav Dor represents this in woodcut is, as Sorin states, Dor's texture, the physicality of scratching the mariner's story into wood, each cut marking an indelible line on the page, just as the poem slices into the listener's mind. This form and the representation of the real concerns images which are not necessarily a copy of the real, but a byproduct of the imagination, in the realm of disturbing fantasies and fearful force constitutive of individual subjectivities. Albano stated this. As you can see, there are elements of supernatural here which, as the viewer, cannot understand which is real and which is false. Of course, this is subjective, but also memory and the effects that memory have when we feel such intense fear can play a part in this. And it's very clever how we are not able to understand perhaps where the lines of reality and memory blur. And this is seen throughout the story and is harked back once the tale has been told. The third categorization is how the memories of people we have lost haunt us and make us fear death. This image by Picasso mourns the death of his friend Kasagamas after his suicide. This led to the melancholy of the Blue period and introduces the idea of somebody's death haunting an image. Luke Timans also explored this. He worked from this photo, which was taken from a funeral, and was a memento circulated to grieving loved ones. She has a melancholic expression, sickly pallor. It seems to almost forbear her death, and her memory appears almost as a ghost. She's fading and shrinking away from the frame, and the only dark spots are of the permanent images and the permanent objects that do not fade in death, of her glasses and her clothes. Song Dong's Waste Not exhibition is also a great example of this, as the objects that somebody leaves behind can be displayed almost as a shrine to their memory, but reveals the absence of them and explores how memory can be held and perhaps elicit a kind of fear of death within this as we realise how much we leave behind when we die. Jim Kay's illustrations to A Monster Calls, I believe, are a great example of narrative illustration that explores these themes. Here, Connor's granddad has a huge part in the representation of the monster, as he died in a similar way to the way in which Connor's mother is currently dying of terminal cancer. Connor's fears of death and his inability to cope with what is going on manifests itself as this monster. And the illustrations and techniques that Jim Kay uses are incredibly evocative of these overwhelming fears that we have when faced with the idea that all we will have left of somebody is the memory of them. Now, this is an incredibly evocative way, and as Albano states, the artist transforms domesticity into a frightening space where ordinary objects linger threateningly by elusively rehearsing a tragic fate made up of haunting memories. This is what I believe Jim Kay successfully does here by transforming a yew tree into a monster. And theories about hauntology will be introduced here. Mark Fisher's works and Derrida will be included because this talks about the haunting of the familiar and the uncanny. The fourth categorization is the fear of losing ourselves, and this increases as we age, as we fear losing our memories, which in turn will make us lose ourselves. Uttermohlen's self-portraits here show his decline into dementia, and Maria Lasning's self-portrait explores ideas of the fragility of the human body and how our mind decays with the passing of time. Now, Arthur Rackham's illustrations to the story of Rip Van Winkle are a great example here of narrative illustration to a story that explores how an old man goes to sleep and wakes up 60 years later and his whole life has been taken from him. These illustrations, I feel, explore these ideas of loss and memory and the self in a terrifying way, and the colours used here are really interesting because, as you may have noticed, the narrative illustrations in all of my other examples are black and white. This is the only one that uses colour, which is interesting as I believe colour here and to do with memory and fear is incredibly poignant, and the fact that so many of them use black and white and the colours here are so muted can really be explored in terms of form and medium. As these images show us, fear and memory here is the overarching theme and presents a terrifying story about what can happen when we lose ourselves. And so this is the overarching themes of this essay, and will include ideas about the supernatural and how memory and fear present itself, but also elements of haunting and hauntology, and also theories about how fear is psychologically embedded within our memories.